Welcome to the Aurora Research Institute Grant Writing Workshop, Creating a Research Budget video. These slides were created by Amanda Chalk-Parrott at the Aurora Research Institute. The Aurora Research Institute and Hotisada have put together this basic overview to help people new to research understand how research is funded in Canada. If you want any more information after this presentation, don't forget to check out the other documents and videos posted in this section of our website. A good budget is one of the most important things any research project can have. A budget allows you to create a plan for spending your research funding, make sure that you always have enough funds to successfully do everything you need to do to complete your research project. So before we start talking about how to make a research budget and what you need to consider, let's talk about some of the terminology used in this session. In the next few slides, we'll define cash and in-kind contributions with examples. We'll talk about the difference between the direct and indirect costs of research, which type of costs need which type of funding. We'll define matching funds in different budget categories. And understanding the budget terminology is important because some funding programs will only cover direct costs of research, while some require matching funds or in-kind contributions, and some will only cover certain budget categories like travel, but not others like salaries. So cash contributions are exactly as the name would suggest. These are financial contributions used for the direct costs of research and research activities. In-kind contributions are non-monetary goods or services that partners, sponsor organizations, and institutions provide that are going to be essential to the research or the research activities. In-kind contributions are assigned a financial value, and that's the cash equivalent, which if it wasn't donated, that's what you'd have to pay with research funds for the goods or service. And then you include that in the project budget. In-kind contributions can include the use of specialized equipment, time spent providing specialized skills, time attending meetings, office space, and staff time. Both cash and in-kind contributions need to be accounted for and included in your research budget. Here are some examples of cash and in-kind contributions and what they might look like. A cash contribution may be $30,000 in cash requested from a funding agency like NSERC. An in-kind contribution may be the Aurora Research Institute committing to have their field technicians spend 30 hours of time doing field sampling for your research project. The technicians are providing a service, not money, and the in-kind support is valued at $5,000. In-kind contributions will always have a cash value attached to them. So what does that look like in a research budget? Well, the cash contributions and the in-kind contributions are listed as separate columns. You'll see examples of this throughout the presentation. The next set of terms we'll look at are the direct and indirect costs of research. So much like cash and in-kind support, knowing the difference between direct and indirect costs are an important consideration when preparing your research budget. Tri-agency grants only support the direct costs of research. That's because the tri-agencies that also administer the Research Support Fund, and that's a specific fund designed to cover indirect costs of research. So the other funding programs focus on direct costs. And the direct costs are those expenses that are directly related to research projects. They'll be identified specifically and accurately with a specific research project, where direct costs are things like research related to travel, salary of research staff, honoraria for elders and knowledge holders, specialized equipment and supplies. Now, your indirect costs are those not directly attributed to or traceable to a specific research project. Indirect costs enable research overall. So they're things like library and computer fees, rent of office space, building operation costs like heat and electricity, even your custodial services, insurance and legal services. So matching funds are a little bit easier to understand now that we know the difference between cash and in-kind contributions. Matching funds are all of the cash or in-kind contributions to a research project that are made by the organizations other than the sponsoring agency. Your sponsoring agency is your funder, so those are the tri-agencies, and these are matching funds that are brought to the project from other sources. Take a look at an example. This is a very basic sample budget for a small research project. Let's say the researcher is applying to CIHR, that's the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, one of our tri-agencies. The budget is broken down by budget category, which we'll discuss next. So let's see. The researcher is requesting $9,000 cash from the funder, and that's $6,000 for a project manager salary, $2,000 for a vehicle rental, $1,000 for a hotel. The rest of the budget, let's see here, is matching funds. The research also has funds budgeted, committed by ARI to $6,000 of in-kind support. Remember, in-kind support means they're providing goods and services to the project. So in this case, ARI is committing, in this case, ARI is providing sample bottles valued at $1,000 and the time of the technicians valued at $5,000. The budget also shows cash support from Hotisera. Hotisera is providing the project with $3,000 cash, and that's to be used for translation and printing posters. Remember, the total cost of a research project is the amount of money from the funding agency and the matching funds. There it is. So you can see between the money requested from the funder and the matching funds brought to the project, the total cost is $18,000. So the researcher is asking for 50% of the total cost of the project from the funder, which is in this case CHR. 50% of the cost of the project is coming from matching funds. And understanding the matching funds is important as many funders and programs cannot fund 100% of the cost of a research project. Researchers are often required to secure matching funds, either cash or in kind. So when you're applying for research funding, matching funds can be demonstrated by submitting letters of support from organizations that are promising cash or in-kind support of your project. So switching gears now, we'll talk about budget categories. Budgets are broken down according to categories. We've seen some examples of this on earlier slides. And as mentioned earlier, it's important to understand budget categories as funding programs are very specific as to what they will and will not fund. Some funding programs will cover salaries, some will not. Some will provide money for only equipment and nothing else. Common budget categories are shown in the infographic on the screen. So when you begin to create your budget for your research project, the best practice is to organize your budget by category. This list doesn't capture everything, and you may find that you need more budget categories than are listed here, or you might not need all of the categories listed here. Okay, so now for the task at hand, we are making a research budget. Where do you even start? Well, the next couple of slides will talk you through the steps of creating your research budget. These are adapted from an article published by Jonathan O'Donnell in the Research Whisperer. The link's provided on the screen, and it's also in the PDF document you'll find in this section of the website. The first step for creating a research budget is to make a list of everything that needs to get done as part of the project. Make a list of everything you plan to do in the project and who is going to do it. From here, you can break down each task into a smaller task. Take your research methodology and turn it into a step-by-step plan. Do you want to interview 20 hunters? Write that on your list. Where do you want to interview the hunters? Do you need to travel? Write it on your list. Do you want to collect environmental samples? Write that on your list. Are you performing statistical analysis on your sample? Do you need to ship your samples to a laboratory? Do you want to share your research with stakeholders, conferences? You guessed it, write all of it down. By the end, you should feel like you've thought through the entire project in detail. You should be able to walk someone else through the project. Go grab a friend or a coworker and read them your list. If they ask questions, write down the answers. This will help you get to the level of specificity you need for the next step. So now you've got your list full of all the things you want your research project to be able to do. And you've checked it twice. Step 2 in making the research budget is checking the rules. It's time to sit down and read those funding agency guidelines and see if all the things you want to be able to do are eligible for funding. Once you've listed everything, go back, read through those specific rules. What is and is not allowed? If the funding program won't pay for travel, you'll need to fund your travel from somewhere else or cross it off the list. Some funding programs won't fund people. Others won't fund travel. It's important to know what you need for your project so you can see what will be funded and what you need to get elsewhere. Let's take a look at some examples of funding guidelines for some of the tri-agency funding programs. So this is an example from an NSERC Applied Research Tools and Instruments grant, ARTI. So you can see from this example, the funding program does not provide money for salary or benefits, insurance costs, or consumables. The funding program does provide money for equipment, installation, training, and travel to support commissioning of the new instrument. So here's another example. This is from a SHRC Insight Development Grant, and these guidelines are laid out differently than the NSERC program that we just looked at, but they provide similar information. What expenses are allowed and what are not allowed. So these guidelines clearly state funds from the funding program cannot be used for paying guest speakers a fee or paying their travel. No member of the grant team can be paid using grant funds. The guidelines state that funds from the SHRC Insight Development Grant can be used for consultation fees for professionals that are not part of the grant team. So this last example is from the College and Community Innovation Fund. That's all tri-councils together funding innovation within colleges. These guidelines reference the Tri-Agency Financial Administration Guide. That'll be covered in detail in the following session, Financial Administration of Tri-Agency Grants. But these guidelines give you the additional information that in your funding application, you can request up to 50% of the salary for collaborators who work for not-for-profit organizations. So far, a research budget procedure can be summarized as make a list, check it twice, check the rules. It's important to know what you can and cannot request money for, and as we've seen in the examples, every agency and program will have slightly different guidelines and rules. There's lots more to learn on this topic, so I'd recommend checking out the next video in this session on financial administration of tri-agency grants. So moving on to the next step in the research budget process, we've got an exhaustive list. We have checked it twice and crossed off anything that is not eligible for funding because you need to find separate funding for that. The third step in making your budget is to cost out each line item. So go back to your detailed list of everything you need to do and start adding a price to every task. For larger, more expensive items, you'll likely need to seek quotes. So now you need to organize all the information, if you haven't already, into Microsoft Excel or another spreadsheet program of your choice. Really what you want to be able to do is keep everything organized, clear for the viewer, and being able to add and multiply lines will help you get through most of it. The draft budget will look different for everyone and every research project, but generally your first column will be your budget categories and the description of the expenses, and the first row can include headings such as number of units, cost per unit, total cost, number of days, things like that. You'll want to be able to show how you're breaking down the expenses. Is it, the total cost of someone's time needs to be also shown in hours, how much per hour, how many hours are you talking about? All those details are important to be able to show in your budget. So in the next few slides, we'll take a look at a few different examples of what your budget spreadsheet might look like. So this example is a pretty simple budget and it doesn't have expenses broken down by expense category. Simply lists the budget items in the left-hand column, followed by the number of items and the cost per item. The total cash cost can be calculated using formulas in Excel. You can see supporting resources on the Research Cash website for links to more Excel tutorials. In this example, the budget categories are listed in the far left column. The budget separated cash and in-kind contributions in the top row. If we look at the headings in the top row, there they are. This budget shows 3 different sources of funding. The funding agency, this case it might be NSERC, the project sponsor number 1, so this could be maybe the GNWT providing funding, and the project sponsor 2, and so let's say that's the Aurora Research Institute. And here we can see another different example of the research budget. This one is broken down by month. The expenses are broken down by expense category on the left column. Again, to highlight one of the great features in Excel, you can use Excel to calculate the totals every month and every year for every budget category. And that allows the program to do the heavy lifting for you. Our final example shows a budget for travel and accommodation costs associated with bringing NWT residents together to host a meeting in Inuvik. You'll notice the right-hand columns and costs are separated by what is being asked for by the sponsor, that's the funding agency, and what is being provided in kind. You can see from these examples, there's no one-size-fits-all budget. So yeah, those are the 2 categories. But you can see that there's no one-size-fits-all budget template to use when you're creating a research budget. And if you're feeling stuck, try contacting the research services or the Office of Research at the institution that you're applying for funding through. They should have a template to help you get started. We've also provided some basic templates along with resources for this session. So you're almost done creating your research budget. So once everything is organized into a spreadsheet, maybe have a friend or a colleague take a look and talk about whether you may have over or undershot any of your expenses. If you don't have enough money, you may be stuck not being able to complete all the components of your research project, which could have significant impacts on the outcomes. On the other end, if you overestimate and ask for too much money, the funding agency might deny your request for being unreasonable. If your research budget is particularly high for one budget category, for example, travel, you'll need to justify the expenses. So we'll talk about that in a few more slides. Before we move on, let's take a look at some of the completed research budgets that we can use as examples. So this is a budget from an application to the Saskatchewan Health Research Fund. The application is asking for a total of $48,137, with 100% of the cost to be covered by SHRF. There it is. And this is a budget for an application for an NSERC Connection grant. That's for virtual networking. The budgets that are submitted on funding applications may look different than what you've created in your Excel spreadsheet. It's a best practice to create a detailed Excel budget, as this will help you with planning your research project and also keeping your spending and expenses in check while you track and are carrying out the research project. And then you can always just slide into the funder's template, whatever it is that they're asking for. So here we can see an example of a funding application to CIHR, and the funding program requests a bit more information, description of what every expense is. So you can see they've had to be quite detailed, talk about the cost, number of hours, number of weeks, how much the honoraria are, all of these details in a budget. So the final step in creating a research budget is to justify your expenses. Now you could argue that justifying your budget isn't part of the budget process, but it is necessary when you're applying for research funding. The budget justification is often a separate document that gives an explanation or purpose for every item listed in the budget. You want to link your budget justification to the objective of your research project. So best practices include, you want to explain how the item relates to the objective of your project. Verify the cost by describing what math you used, what's the logic you used to determine the dollar amount. Reference institutional policies wherever you need to. An example is honoraria. The Aurora Research Institute or the GNWT, they have set honoraria totals that are used for half days or full days. You want to reference that is why you're choosing to pay that much. You're not making it up as you go along. Justify the budget in the same order that the items appear on your itemized budget. So we can take a look at a couple examples of this. Okay, so here we can see a budget justification. And now this is more than just stating what the money is going to be used for. For this example, the researcher includes $2,000 for travel. A poor justification would be to simply state we need this money to buy 2 round-trip train tickets from Yellowknife to Wrigley. A good explanation will explain why you need this item and how it's related to the objective of your research or doing respectful research. So a better justification is participation and engagement with community members is an accepted best practice in Northern research. Upon completion of the interviews, summary, and preliminary analysis of the results, the research team will present the aggregated results to the community of Wrigley and provide an opportunity for community members to provide insight into the analysis. So, in our first example, a researcher is planning to administer surveys territory-wide, soliciting input from elders about their medical travel experiences. The researcher receives quotes from multiple translators found through the Government of the Northwest Territories Indigenous Language Interpreter and Translators list. They have determined that translating the survey into each of the official languages will cost approximately $9,693 based on quotes. The researcher includes $10,000 for translation in the research budget, and they need to justify why they're including a request for $10,000 for translation. A budget justification could look like this. The Northwest Territories has 11 official languages, 9 of which are Indigenous languages. Participants will be provided the opportunity to complete the survey in their own language. We are requesting funds from the funding agency to support the hiring of local translators to facilitate two-way interpretation and understanding of surveys in the NWT official languages. In our second example, a researcher is requesting funding to organize a one-day symposium to share knowledge about the muskrat species in the Gwich'in settlement area. The researcher plans to bring together experts in both Western science and local ecological knowledge to exchange information, build connections, and shape future research and monitoring priorities. The researcher wants to include 20 traditional knowledge holders or elders, and the honoraria rate at ARI is $225 per day. They've included $4,500 in their budget for honoraria and need to justify this expense. The budget justification could look something like, in the Northwest Territories, it is customary to provide an honoraria to unsalaried elders and knowledge holders. The honoraria recognizes the value of the knowledge they are sharing and compensation for participation in events. Honorary rates are based on the Aurora Research Institute's established rate of $225 per day. Honoraria will be provided to local presenters who are sharing their knowledge, participating elders, and participants who are attending as unsalaried community representatives. The budget of $4,500 will provide $225 to each of the 20 traditional knowledge holders or elders in attendance. So this is an example from an application for funding to Saskatchewan Health Research Fund. It's first study looking at patient satisfaction of telemedical services. It's based at the University of Saskatchewan. You can see they are justifying the personnel cost of a half-time nurse study coordinator, 0.5 FTE. The expenditure over 1 year is broken out, so you can see, and that's the cost including that 12.3% is usually your overhead in terms of salary, benefits, insurance, the total cost of employing a person. They've included honoraria and gifts, and they've included software licensing. So now you have the building blocks of a successful research budget. Some more top tips to help you get it right on the first try. Be sure to read your funding agency guidelines. Ask the funding agency or your institution's Office of Research if you need clarification on anything that remains unclear. Review the funding agency's guidelines to ensure expenses are eligible. As we've said, some programs may not fund salaries, they may not fund travel, they may only fund equipment. You'll want to know this before you go to all of the trouble of preparing and submitting your proposal. Find out if the funding agency requires a separate document called the budget justification. As we've been through, that is a special section of the proposal, provides more information for the reviewers to know how you determine the budget costs the way you did. If you're budgeting for salary, look up the institution's human resources policies and guidelines so you know if you need to be able to pay vacation pay, northern living allowance, benefits, RSPs. All of that needs to go into your budget consideration. If you've secured matching funds, be sure that the matching funds are eligible to be considered by the funding agency. To start developing your budget, use Microsoft Excel or another program that you're comfortable with. And to submit your budget to the funding agency, use the budget form or template that the agency has provided. If they haven't provided one, check with your institution because they may have a budget template you can use. When you're making your budget, be realistic. Don't inflate the budget in an attempt to secure more money for your project, but also don't underestimate the budget in hopes that it will be more attractive to reviewers. Reviewers may perceive a poorly put together budget as a poorly planned project. Be detailed and specific. List all the budget items that clearly show the calculations you used to arrive at each dollar value. Keep this list to remind yourself how the numbers were determined. This worksheet will be a valuable resource that can be used for monitoring the project's progress, and you'll need it for reporting as the project proceeds. If working on a budget with multiple sponsors, for example, maybe a tri-agency funder and maybe a government funder, maybe your own institution is contributing too, you'll want to clearly separate the budget on your detailed worksheet to show how the expenditures work by sponsor. That's for each funder. Ensure that the amounts of cash or in-kind support from each sponsor match the amount provided in the letter of support. Think about all the in-kind contributions towards the project. Recall that in-kind contributions are all non-monetary goods and services that are provided. Include in-kind contributions under a separate budget category to ensure they're recognized as part of the total project cost. If the funding agency asks for a budget justification or a description of the budget, give an explanation. State its purpose for every item in the budget. Link the cost of the objective to the objective of your project if possible. So that's it for creating a research budget. Thank you, Mussy Cho, for joining me. Check out the rest of our resources on the Research Cash website for more research grant writing, advice, and resources.